All right, so would you like me to start?
You can just start whenever you want.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, I just want to thank you guys for inviting me. I'll just introduce myself a little bit. I'm Renee Collins. I am a local author. I have three novels. I don't know if you can, actually with screen share you can't see me. So my first novel is Relic. It's a young adult fantasy, alternate historical fantasy. My second novel is called Until We Meet Again, which is another young adult novel with a kind of a time travel twist. And then my third novel is called Remember Me Always, which is another young adult novel. They're all three standalones. They are not related, but really the most book that I did my most of my world building for was Relic. So that's where I'll talk a little bit about that process. But I've definitely done a lot of research and kind of have a little bit of a passion for world building, and I think it's probably a common passion for writers to have. We like to create, we like to use our imaginations. So there's something about world building that I think just is a lot of fun for many of us. Some people it's, a pain in the butt, but hopefully I can give a few little pointers and tips from what I've gleaned over the years as an author and a writer and a studier of the craft. So yeah, let's build a world together. Oops, sorry, that's an accidental thing. This is just a picture from, I was meant to move that later in my presentation, but this is this is a picture from all the notebooks that I have filled over the years of not even necessarily stories, but just notes on stories, just to kind of prove that I'm a bit of a, as a disclaimer, I'm a bit of a obsessive planner. So for me, world building involves a lot of planning. Um, and that may not be the case for you. There are writers who are very much kind of create as they go. And so my presentation might come across, if it comes across with a bias of planning and outlining, I apologize, but I think any of the things that I'm talking about can be applied in like an editing process or in the writing process. So anyway, so basically I'm going to kind of focus on, there's three, when we talk about world building, I see it as kind of broken down into three broader categories. The first one is just building an entirely new world from scratch. It's a world that exists only in that story, compared to creating a new world or a secret world within our existing world. And I will give examples of each of these, but I'm just kind of, this is just an introduction. So yes, a world that exists within the world that we live in, but it's its own little world there. And then the third type of world is changing the world as we know it. And so it takes kind of that as a base and flips it around. And again, I will explore some examples of these. So some new worlds. You guys probably recognize these from the film. Middle Earth, of course, is just an entirely brand new world with countries and landscapes of its own. Uh, Pandora from the movie Avatar. This one's a little bit of a stretch because it exists within our universe, but it's its own separate individual world. Everything in that world is new. Um, Arrakis from Dune, same thing. It's kind of, it's just a completely contained its own world. Some other examples are Narnia, which again, Narnia and Oz, or sorry, Neverland, again, they have associations with our world, but they do exist completely separate from it. Earthsea, Oz, and the Star Wars worlds. That's my favorite planet, Hoth. Okay, a world within our world. Hogwarts and the Harry Potter magic community. It's kind of its own individual community with its all the components of a world building world, but it exists secretly within the world that you and I live in. So it's kind of separate, but some of the events relate to it. And there's a little bit of overlap sometimes, which is common. Another example would be in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, the Wonka's factory. I would argue, I would make my stand that this is a world, includes all kinds of world building, but of course it exists only in one little space. This is a great example of like, there's world building even in a one building, story, but this is absolutely a world, and we could quite, can explore and get lost in the imagination of this world just like we would a planet, a whole world. A couple of other examples, the book Watership Down. That's a world within our world, but it's different because it's rabbits. It's the world of rabbits and their culture and society. And so, it's very much in our world, but it's a world we don't know about, their community. Similar, the City of Bones is an example I used for paranormal, kind of the urban. There's a lot of urban fantasy that sort of supposes, Twilight would be another example, that there's, the secret world of vampires within our world, the secret world of demon hunters within our world, that most people, you and I, could go about in our day-to-day and cross paths with a vampire and we wouldn't know. So that's, that kind of urban fantasy or paranormal often is a world within a world. And then I love the Borrowers. I loved that as a kid. Same thing, just this kind of secret, everything has the flavor of its own culture, but it's within our world, but it interacts very much with our world. Sometimes they don't interact much at all. Sometimes the interaction with the normal world is an integral part of that world building. So, and then there's our world kind of tweaked. The Golden Compass, this series, it's sort of like, and you find out later that it's like, there's like parallel worlds and parallel universes, but it looks like our world. There's cities and countries that are our world, but it's different. There's people have the little demons, the spirit animal kind of things that follow them along. And so it's a lot of recognizable components of our world, but then with just a little bit of a twist. Shameless plug, my book, Relic, same kind of thing. This book it's set in Old West, Colorado, actually. Western Colorado was my inspiration for this book. But it's different it's the kind of the Old West with magic. It supposes that fantasy creatures and dragons and mermaids had existed and are now extinct instead of dinosaurs. And so the mining of the Old West is to mine these magical, or the fossils of these magical creatures retain properties, and they're kind of a commodity that is mined and traded in the day. So I included a lot of recognizable tropes and imagery of the Old West, but just with a twist, a magical twist. So yeah, also another common subgenre of our world tweaked would be like a dystopian novel, like 1984 or Hunger Games. It's set in our world, but it's different. It's recognizable, but also completely different in a way, which is, I think, fun for people to see. So yeah, as far as what world or what kind of world you pick, it's up to you. It's there's, I think, a draw and an imagination can be equal in any of these three kinds of worlds. There are two, and I didn't invent this. This is kind of you might have even heard of this. There's two sort of approaches to world building. And one of them is the top-down approach, and the other one is, I'll just click the other one. The other one is the bottom-up approach. So the top-down approach is kind of, it's almost like starting zoomed out and zooming in. It's starting with the big basics. It could be landscape. It could be in science fiction. It could be the sort of scientific rules. Like, I want to write a book. I want this planet to have a lot of gravity, or I don't know, I'm not really a science person, full disclosure. I can't think of on the fly a really good example of that. But that's kind of the top-down approach, is starting with big, broad strokes. This is an ice planet. This is um, an underwater world, and then get you go down, down, narrow down into finer details. And the bottom up approach is the opposite. You start with something small and then kind of build the world out from there. So, you could say, I want to do, say you want to write a science fiction novel and you're picturing this spaceship, kind of a rickety old spaceship flying through space, and you kind of have this spaceship in your mind and the characters, and then you sort of build a world around that. For my very first novel, which actually the idea for Relic, um, the idea for having kind of magical creatures that were extinct, the conventional magical creatures we all know that are now extinct, and their fossils retain magical properties. That was an idea that came to me from a bottom-up approach. I just had this image. So I actually used this idea for a novel that I wrote that didn't work, and then I took the concept and mixed it around and put it in the story Relic. But for my first idea, for my first story, it was, I just saw these dwarves mining in a mountain, and they were mining dragon bones, and they were magical dragon bones. And I just thought that, I just had that image. And so I started kind of building a world around that one little idea. And yeah, you can kind of see there's the pros and cons for both would be with the top-down approach. You're probably more likely to have a lot more detail than you might end up using in your story. So it's going to require you to have some judgment on when to slice things off, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. But the advantages obviously would be you have, when you have the broader idea of the world, you don't have to sort of you've got the big rules already set, so you won't, there's less of a chance that you'll run it in your story, you'll run into a problem where you're like, shoot, I can't, this isn't consistent, this thing I wanted to do with the story isn't consistent, which you might have happen when you're doing a bottom-up approach. And you want to build you have a character in mind or a school, and when you're building the world around it, it's maybe not as fully thought out yet, and you could run into some plot holes or some problems. But really, either approach is great. And of course, as with all things in writing, you'll probably end up doing a little bit of both. It's kind of like sometimes you can get like with my story with Relic, I had that image of the dwarves mining the fossils, and I took it, so that was small, and then I kind of wanted to pull back and say, okay, what is this world, and wanted to do a top-down approach. So your approach may be, and probably will be, a little bit of both, kind of a zigzag in a way. So yeah, and that's okay. So I sort of kind of narrow down in my mind the 5 big basics that every world is going to need, I think the 5 basics in a story where the world plays a big role. Rules, of course. If you are building a world of any kind, unless it is a modern contemporary story set in our world exactly, chances are you're going to have to come up with rules. And this is important with magic systems. It's important in science fiction with science. You have to, one of the tricky things about, let's say, magic is, or in science fiction, when we're sort of expanding our idea of science, the temptation is, because the sky's the limit, because your imagination is the limit, there's the temptation to be like, well, actually you can do a magical spell where that happens, but then you get into problems. And I think if you're familiar with the Harry Potter series, there's a couple of examples of that where it's like, but wait a minute, why didn't they, if you could just do that magical trick, why didn't you do that in book three when they were having, so, and that's probably because I would imagine with J.K. Rowling, and this is pure speculation on my part, but I imagine she probably did kind of a bottom up approach with her magic. She didn't necessarily come up with big, solid rules right from the beginning. I think she kind of was building as she was going. No hate towards Harry Potter. I am a huge fan, but I'm just showing, and you can probably think of examples in other stories as well, where the magic, because it has no rules, it creates plot holes. So important to have rules established right from the beginning. You know, again, I'll use my book Relic. Um, the fossils, they all have a specific kind of properties. The bigger the piece, the more magic. You need to decide, are there costs to using the magic? Does it, if your characters can transport, zap themselves, teleport places, are they exhausted for 24 hours after? Does the, and I think these things, while it makes the story more difficult, it actually enhances the story because it adds stakes. It adds a little bit of risk because, and I think it feels more relevant because we do live in a world where there are lots and lots of rules and there's lots of costs and things don't come to us for free. So it feels more real when our characters don't just have things come to them. The next kind of basic that I think every world has is a power structure. Even with a small world, even if you're just talking about, a magical school or, your world is I don't know, a small country and you don't exactly expand on the whole world yet, there's going to be some sort of power. And if there's pure anarchy, that in a way is a power structure on its own, which comes with its own complications that you really need to fully explore. But there's always, this adds a realness to your story and a richness to have a kind of power structure, and also to really think through how does your power structure affect your main character. In general, I think I heard, I was actually on a panel. This is probably sounds braggy, but I was on a panel with Brandon Sanderson once, and it was very cool. But I felt like he was just, I was like, whatever he says, just listen to him. But he said to think about when you're picking a story or when you're looking at the power structure in your world, think about picking a character that it's tempting to want to pick a king or a queen or a president, but think about someone who is the power structure affects them in a unique way, because that can then drive the whole story, move it forward, add stakes. And we're always trying to add stakes when we're writing. There needs to be a sense, something that keeps the reader turning the pages, some sense of peril or danger or intrigue, and stakes will do that for you. Landscape. This one is, it's going to vary. Sometimes you're going to set your story in, like, take for example the Game of Thrones series. The landscape is not particularly, in general, it's not particularly unique. It's just kind of essentially Earth-like, and that's very common because the focus of the story isn't the tension and the stakes don't come from the landscape. They come from the sort of power dynamics, etc. But even in the Game of Thrones series, there's some interesting landscape features, and I think like the Wall is one of them. The Wall up in the north, it's this big, huge frozen, wall that keeps out the kind of above, the lie beyond. So yeah, even in a world where there's more, it's more set, more or less set in an Earth-like setting, there still can be interesting features in the world that add some dimension. And then I was a history major in college, so I of course find history to be just such an important part of where we are in life, and I think it's the same in a story. Um, you obviously don't have to necessarily think up the whole world history of your book. It probably will not be relevant to the story, but just to acknowledge that things that happened in the past create a domino effect that will change the lives of your characters and possibly even created the world. The picture I chose is, from Lord of the Rings, where he has that moment, um, Isildur, where he can throw the ring into Mount Doom, but he decides to keep it. And that one moment kind of changes the course of that whole story and creates, and that's I think why in the movies they start with that moment, because it's important. It's important to see. Um, and so yeah, it's every good story has a little bit of history, or every good world has a little bit of history to it. And then, of course, details, um, like cultures or rituals, food, animals, interesting plants. Uh, Depending on the kind of story you're telling, it might have more or less, fewer or greater details. But I included, if you notice, I included a lot of the different kinds of worlds, or all three of the kinds of worlds. There's, the whole new world with like Pandora, and they have their rituals where they're all there by the interesting trees that they like connect with. And then there's the world within our world of Harry Potter, that even though it's in our world, it has its own, interesting candies, and they kind of have their fun things going on. And our world tweaked, with the Hunger Games, same thing. They have their rituals, and even though the food they eat and all that stuff in general was just the landscape, it's all somewhat similar to ours, but adding just a little bit of detail can kind of make your world pop. So I sort of also included these kind of the pillars of quality world building. These are like more what I would say are guidelines to consider uh, when building a world. One of them is balance. And we talked, or I just talked about detail and adding world building. Um, but I think it's important to not get carried away. And like I said, I love world building. I think it's fun. I think it's you let your imagination go wild. But think of it as a spice. There are, Orson Scott Card says there's like the four kinds of stories, the mice quotient, and his part of that is there's stories that are milieu stories, where that's kind of the main thrust of the book, and those definitely happen, but they are, I think, less common, where the world is the big thing that you're sort of, let's say, the selling point of the book. Probably less common, and therefore world building details should be used sparingly. Now, you can think of examples where that is. So Orson Scott Card says that Lord of the Rings is a milieu story, even though we can think of like Frodo's journey and Aragorn, and we can think of all the cool characters and the interesting plot events. But why in the Fellowship, um, as they're going along their way and they meet Tom Bombadil, and does he have any real relevance to the main plot? No, but it's a cool little moment and it's interesting, and these are details that add spice to the world. And it works in that story. In another story, someone might find that obnoxious, that there's, if your characters are on this quest, and say the quest is the main thrust of the story, and then you stop and just have them kind of meet this cool random character to show the world, they might think that's boring, and you might lose interest even though you think it's cool. And of course, the show don't tell when it comes to world building, um, especially with the details. You can talk about the rich cultures of your world, but it would have much more impact if you can find a way where to have your main characters experience and encounter those rich details in a way that is relevant to the story rather than just to kind of talk about it. And then, like I just said, world building details are most interesting to the reader when they are part of the plot, when they come into play as part of the story and not necessarily just, there's a lot of fantasy novels where there's the journey, the journey, the quest is a big part of the story. And you're naturally going to encounter a lot of different aspects of world building in that. And that's cool. It's been done a lot. And so maybe try to think of some new and fresh way to have your character encounter different aspects of your world that's not necessarily just them traveling through your world, if that makes sense. But that is including it in the plot, and it's totally valid. I'm not bashing on that. Um, this is just a fun little picture of when I was writing my very, very first novel. And, I drew a map and I made up countries and I developed different cultures and I like drew their like clothes and thought out that, I went to town in my mind and I filled that whole notebook, two notebooks actually, with uh, details, and it was a lot of fun. And so you can do that. I'm not telling you not to do it. Go for it. What do you do with it? I don't know if you guys like watching Sherlock, but Sherlock talks about the mind palace, which is where he kind of stores all this information. And so I would argue a lot of your details when if you're a big world builder and you love it, especially if you're doing a top-down approach, keep them in the mind palace. You don't learn to be willing to kind of the phrase "murder your darlings." I think also applies to world building. Be willing to, but I don't like murder, so that's why I say put it in the mind palace, because it will have a place. Keep it locked away, and there may come a time where you're like, what I can do in this moment is this cool thing that I thought about, this cool, ritual that they do. Maybe we can put that in the story, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's not wasted time. It's not. It just maybe doesn't all belong in your book. So that is the balance is one of the big things you'll have to think about and come to grasp with when building your world is how much to put in and how much to just say this culture that I invented is so cool, but if it doesn't work in this story, maybe I'll save it. And because like I said with Relic, I had that idea of this magic system, and that story didn't necessarily work out, but I kept that little magic system in my mind palace. And when I was thinking of excuse me, I was actually reading a book on, it was like a journal of a woman in the Old West, and I just thought, man, that's such a cool setting. What would make it even cooler? Magic. And then I thought, what kind of magic? And lo and behold, the little detail, this magical system of magical relics of creatures popped into my head. There it was in the mind palace, and I was like, oh yeah, I can use that. So everything you're working on will add a richness to your story, even if it is not necessarily included, if that makes sense. So excuse me. Okay. Oh, there's a picture of me in Moriarty, but I meant to edit that out. Sorry. The other, sorry, I don't know why that went away. Okay, I'm sorry. It was a cool little gee whiz thing, but I'm not very good at PowerPoints. What I was going to say with selectivity is using, this is similar with balance. This is kind of the next step of balance, and it's using the details that are going to add the most to your story. And I showed the little detail of Dracula burning in the sunlight, or whoever that was. That's probably the wrong name, but and that if you're going to think of all the interesting details about a vampire, the fact that they can't smell garlic or whatever, it's like, okay, that's cool, but burning in the sun, now that's interesting. That's dynamic. So when you are thinking about what to put in your world, try to pick something that's going to try to because if we go with the premise that we can't include every little detail in the book, maybe include the details that are going to add the most to your plot, are going to capture the imagination, that are going to kind of create those stakes like we talked about. If you're writing a book about a vampire, and they have to get back to their coffin before dawn, that's going to create stakes. Dawn is coming, we gotta go, we gotta go, more so than the garlic again. This doesn't fly by again. Okay. Logic. The world has to make sense. And this is tricky because you are building a world. So you are making the rules. So technically you can pick what you want and it's just say, well, that's in my world. That's just how it is in my world. But it has to make sense to your reader. It can't be so, it has to have a believability factor. I remember I was doing a workshop with some authors and they were having me read the first like 2 chapters of their book, and then we kind of workshopped it. And one girl had a story where it was set in a high school and kind of like it was sci-fi-ish, and someone like graffitied on her locker, some mean name. And in like the next part of the chapter, she's like being interviewed on the news, and everyone is just all over the news. And I was just like, so wait, why? And she's like, well, that's just how it is in my world, because in this world people just did not bully, so bullying was just a big deal and it's on the news. And I think that could have worked. You could argue that she could have made it work, but she didn't. Unfortunately, it didn't make sense. It didn't sit in a believable way. So that's, I guess, what I mean when I say makes sense. It has to be something that your reader is going to buy into on some level. And I hear a lot from writers when they're world building. Well, that's just how it is in this world. That's just how it is in my world. And if you have to be saying that, you're probably off track. If you have to be justifying something in your world by saying, well, that's just in this world, people do that, it probably means that your reader doesn't buy it. It doesn't have that kind of internal logic. And if you want to go there, if you want to pick something really intense, you have to make it work. You have to sell it. Because yes, there's a fine line between being something being interesting and then something being unbelievable. And that little, as close as you can get to that line is great, because we want things to be shocking, to be exciting, to be intriguing, but you can push it into the category where it's just unbelievable and people don't buy it. And that is the danger when you're creating cultures and reactions. Oh, yes, don't let your readers feel this way. Also, be aware of your learning curve, and this is kind of goes along with that logic. You want when people are being introduced to your world, if you have so many things that are new and different, so many things that you could say, well, in my world, this is just how this is this way. And people are going to be feeling like the little boy on the right who just doesn't get it. You want people to be enjoying the newness of your world, not having to be like, wait, why did this character do that? Why did that happen? Why are they all jumping off a cliff right now? Like, it may be dynamic and interesting and new, but you don't want your reader to just be really confused as to why it's happening. And again, here's where you could make an argument that it's all about how you're selling it, and anything can be done. You could probably think of an example of anything of extremes that were done well, but you probably shouldn't assume that you're going to do it right. It's a risk you can take, but just be careful and get a lot of readers and a lot of feedback if you're trying something really different. And last is continuity. Um, to not just kind of toss new things in, um, to be aware of the kind of the vibe of your world and stick with it. Like if you're writing a science fiction novel and through the whole novel it's just, you know, more kind of hard science and feels a little bit more like our grounded in our world and our science and our way of interacting, and then they go to a planet that has vampires on it, it's a risk. um, Again, got to be pulled off well. Otherwise, people will just be like, wait, what? Like, why are they now in um, on a vampire planet? I don't get it. And maybe you think it's fresh and new and interesting, but I think it's really important to kind of be aware. And I talk about this a little bit in just a minute, but you have to be aware of like the feel of your world. Um, and you want to keep all of these details kind of consistent with the vibe and the feel of the world you're picking. And this is just kind of a funny little example from when I was, this is when I was really young. This was one of the first books I wrote. It was this princess who was on this quest. Her name's, well, not princess, she was a girl named Samantha. She's on a quest. She's in like the bad guy's castle. And this giant goblin comes in. And for some reason, I decided to name this goblin Mitch, which I think is probably the most ungoblin, like creepy goblin name you could think of. And also, I put him in like white sneakers, jeans, and a t-shirt. I don't understand why, but in my, you know, first grade, second grade mind, I don't know. It just, that was Mitch. Now, do I think this goblin could have had a cooler name, could have looked more menacing and awful? Sure. But we had a little bit of a continuity problem with some of these details. The vibe was a little bit ruined by having a goblin named Mitch in a pink shirt and jeans walk in, but it's okay. I was young. Continuity fail. Okay, concept. This is kind of a harder one to define, but if you think about, you guys have probably heard the phrase high concept. It's something that is talked a lot about in the publishing industry. A lot of like authors or editors want a story that's high concept. And this is my definition, so take it with a grain of salt. What I feel like high concept basically means is you can get a feel for the story within a couple of sentences, within one or two sentences. So it's something that's not so widely contained. Like, for example, Harry Potter, hidden magical school. Um, that is that's high concept. We immediately can gain some kind of idea of what might happen and what we could expect. Same thing with any sort of high concept idea is when someone describes it to you briefly. Like if I said, okay, sorry, I'm going to finish that thought. If someone describes something to you in like one sentence, you start to get an image in your mind. That to me is high concept. If you can imagine and have some sort of emotional, mental response to like, oh, interesting, or ooh, that's going to be bad, that means it's probably high concept. If I were to say, well, my story is about this girl who goes on a quest through this land, and but see, even that's a little more high concept. But you're not going to get really an idea for what the land is. And this is, I could do, and I actually have done a whole presentation on the idea of high concept in general. So it's hard to really define it. But the point is, it's something that can be easily defined. And I would argue that world building needs a concept. And it doesn't necessarily have to be totally high concept, but high concept worlds, just like a high concept plot idea, can stick in our minds. They can capture the imagination. Like if you were creating a fantasy world that had, deserts and grasslands and mountains, that's great. And that may exactly serve your purpose. But if you created a fantasy world where one half of the planet was perpetual day and one half of the planet was perpetual night, and everybody lived on the equator in kind of a dusk dawn situation, like instantly the mind starts saying, interesting. Okay, I can kind of see some of the conflict of what this would be like to be in this world. I can imagine. It starts to capture the imagination a little more. And so I would argue that if you can, if it's important, to have an interesting world in your story, try to give it a concept, try to give it a feel, try to give it something that captures the imagination. And again, this one's a little vague, a little more vague, a little harder to get, but I think that's something that can take your story to the next level. If you are writing a fantasy story, um, it just gives it that little edge. If you have a world that's something they haven't seen before, something they haven't heard before, something that just pops in the mind when you hear about it, like, oh, interesting, they're in a, a bubble under the ocean. Like, it starts the mind going, and that's not necessarily a fresh idea, but it's more high concept. Okay, that is all I have, but I will, here's just my writing um, information where you can find me if you want to connect. And yeah, I like to make writer friends and keep in touch with new writers. But I'll go ahead and stop the screen share.